He was born on a bleak March day in 1890, under the gray skies of Providence, Rhode Island, a city that would become both his sanctuary and his prison. From the moment Howard Phillips Lovecraft took his first breath, darkness seemed to lurk not just around him, but within him. His father, a traveling salesman, was committed to an asylum when Lovecraft was just 3 years old, raving about imagined enemies until his death. And his mother, overprotective and strange, would follow the same path years later. Madness, some whispered, was in his blood. But young Howard found escape in the arcane, the ancient, and the unknown. By 8, he was composing poems in the style of Edgar Allan Poe. By 12, he was writing elaborate essays on chemistry and astronomy. But this wasn't just a precocious child. This was a mind already swimming in deep waters, waters that no man should tread. Homeschooled for much of his life due to fragile health and what his mother called his delicate temperament, Lovecraft rarely played with other children. His world was books, mythology, science, history, and above all, the supernatural. He would spend hours in the attic library, poring over 18th century texts while the city below changed around him. By the time he attended high school, he was already different. Reclusive, spectral. He never graduated. A nervous breakdown, or so the records claim. Others say he simply recoiled from the modern world. This was the dawn of the 20th century. Skyscrapers, jazz, and progress. But Lovecraft looked backward to ancient gods, dead languages, and crumbling mansions where time stood still. He didn't explode onto the literary scene. In fact, he crept in through the back door. Through amateur journalism, Lovecraft found a kindred network of oddballs, dreamers, and fellow outcasts. He began writing essays, publishing small stories in low-circulation magazines. His early work, florid, gothic, drenched in atmosphere, didn't fit the pulpy heroics of the time. But it was here that Lovecraft found his voice. Dagon, written in 1917, was the first real glimpse into what would become the Cthulhu Mythos, a tale of a shell-shocked man recounting a vision of ancient aquatic horrors. It was eerie, existential, and deeply unsettling. Readers didn't know what to make of it. Lovecraft didn't care. In 1924, against all odds, Lovecraft married Sonia Green, a successful Jewish businesswoman from New York. The match baffled many, not least of all Lovecraft himself. She was outgoing, modern, and lived in the bustling metropolis of New York City. Everything Lovecraft was not, but for a time, they made it work. He moved to Brooklyn, tried to acclimate, even wandered the streets alone, writing letters about his disdain for the alien city around him. Ultimately, it fell apart. Lovecraft returned to Providence, alone and poorer than ever. They never divorced, but they never reconciled. Some biographers suggest he never loved her in the conventional sense. Perhaps she was a brief experiment in reality, one that failed. The 1930s were Lovecraft's most prolific years. He wrote feverishly, pouring nightmares onto the page as if possessed. The Call of Cthulhu introduced readers to a universe where ancient godlike beings slumbered beneath the earth and sea, indifferent to humanity. The Shadow over Innsmouth, the Dunwich Horror at the Mountains of Madness. These weren't just horror stories, they were cosmic revelations. In Lovecraft's universe, humans weren't the center of anything. We were ants, scuttling in ignorance while monstrous intelligences watched from the void. It was terrifying and revolutionary. While other horror writers focused on vampires, ghosts, and werewolves, Lovecraft birthed something deeper: existential dread. Though often broke and obscure, Lovecraft was never truly alone. He maintained an enormous correspondence, writing thousands of letters to fellow writers and fans. Robert E. Howard, creator of Conan the Barbarian. August Derleth, who would become Lovecraft's posthumous promoter. Clark Ashton Smith, a fellow fantasist. They formed what later became known as the Lovecraft Circle. They shared ideas, characters, even mythologies. Through this circle, the Cthulhu Mythos took shape, not as a single narrative, but as a shared universe, a secret, sprawling mythology whispered through multiple pens. Lovecraft had become a cult figure before the term even meant what it does today. Lovecraft never found financial success. He lived on the edge of poverty, often skipping meals to save money. His work was published mostly in pulp magazines like Weird Tales, and he was paid peanuts. Worse, he was plagued by internal contradictions. He was a fierce traditionalist, a man out of time, raging against modernity, industrialization, immigration. His personal views, often xenophobic and elitist, have rightly attracted criticism in the years since. He feared change, loathed the melting pot of America, and believed civilization was in decline. These anxieties, warped and extreme, fed his fiction. But they also kept him isolated, even as his work gained a cult following. By the mid-1930s, Lovecraft was a ghost of a man, gaunt, sickly, and tired. He was diagnosed with intestinal cancer in 1936, but refused treatment. He spent his final months in agony, documenting the pain in meticulous detail in his letters. On March 15, 1937, Lovecraft died in poverty, buried in a modest grave in Swan Point Cemetery. His name, at that time, was known to only a few. No obituary in major newspapers, no grand send-off, just another eccentric, forgotten by the world he feared and fascinated by. Death, however, was not the end. In fact, it was just the beginning. August Derleth and others began preserving Lovecraft's writings, publishing them through Arkham House, a small press named after one of his fictional towns. Slowly, Lovecraft's name spread. By the 1960s and 70s, counterculture artists, scholars, and horror enthusiasts were discovering his work. Stephen King cited him as a major influence. Metal bands named albums after his stories. Filmmakers like John Carpenter and Guillermo del Toro openly borrowed from his vision. Lovecraft, once the recluse of Providence, had become the father of modern horror. Today, H.P. Lovecraft is everywhere. Cthulhu is a pop culture icon, adorning everything from plush toys to video games. But beneath the surface, the true horror remains intact. Lovecraft's real gift wasn't just monsters, it was perspective. He taught us that the universe doesn't care, that behind the veil of reality might lurk forces so vast and alien they would shatter our sanity. His stories weren't meant to comfort. They were meant to disturb, to awaken the primal fear that we are not in control and never were. And yet we keep reading, because in that madness, there's a strange kind of truth, a whisper in the dark that maybe, just maybe, the most terrifying thing isn't the unknown, it's the knowledge that the unknown is watching.